You're listening to a free audio download from Venue Cymru's International Concert Series. Welcome to the January edition of pre-concert interviews from Venue Cymru. The Manchester Camerata, under the baton of Stephen Bell, kicked off the new year with a concert of Strauss. Before the festivities, Stephen Bell talked to us about life as a conductor. Previously, you were principal horn of the BBC Concert Orchestra. How do you think this professional level experience as an orchestral player informs your conducting?
Oh gosh, how long have you got? Where do we start? I think the fundamental thing from my point of view, and I've always done this as a conductor, is I've always approached how I put together a project and how I execute a project from the player's side of the tracks, if you like, which means that perhaps I'm always conscious of the player's needs. And I think having sat, from a sort of physical point of view, sat at the back of an orchestra and had a fantastic, if you can imagine where the horn section sits at the back of an orchestra, you've got a fantastic view sort of over and above what happens with the conductor facing you, obviously. And I can kind of, from that, I guess, take a huge amount of experience of working with conductors over the last 20 years, however long I've been with the BBC, which I guess I've kind of taken those experiences on board, both the positive ones and perhaps the non-so-positive ones, and seen where perhaps people lose a collection of 60 people, because it's quite easy to do, you know. If you sit in front of a group or stand in front of a group of 60 very intelligent, very clever, very passionate, very involved musicians, the likelihood is that not all 59 or 60 of them will immediately take to you. And it's a little bit of a kind of psychology exercise as much as anything else, to be able to draw the best from your players and make them want to play well for you. Of course, they want to play well for themselves all the time, and all professional musicians have incredibly kind of high standards and are almost hypercritical all the time. But to be able to draw the best from your players, I always find the best way to do that is to treat them as I, as an orchestra, would expect to have been treated by a conductor. And then you kind of encourage the best, rather than the sort of dictatorial old school, perhaps, where musicians were scared of conductors. In the big bad old days, if a great maestro came to an orchestra, boy, did you do as you... It was like being back at school. You know, you kind of felt that you had to, whereas I prefer to sort of draw by being perhaps slightly more friendly face, if you like. And just to be treated as you would expect. I think it's just, you know, more than anything else, it's kind of good manners, really, and good performance practice, I always think, to sort of draw on the experiences I've had as a player. And then hopefully the orchestra will respond and we get the best results. That's the long and short of it. Not great rocket science, really.
Do you get much chance to play the horn at the moment, or has conducting taken...
The horn came out of the box on Christmas Eve. I stood in front of my local pub with a few colleagues from the village and we played some Christmas carols. Yes, I do still play. In fact, I still am in the concert orchestra. But the conducting side of my musical activities is certainly, in the last sort of 6 or 7 years, has completely taken over. So, yeah.
And what's it like being a guest conductor?
Being a guest conductor is a funny one, because when you have a position with an orchestra, I'm not speaking from experience here because I don't, but when a conductor has it's a slightly different relationship, I suppose, in that as a guest, at the back of your mind always is that you'd quite like to be invited back if you've enjoyed the experience. So you kind of have to be on your best behaviour a little bit. Not that I would do anything other than that anyway, but I guess it is a slightly different kind of animal. To be a guest conductor, you're with an orchestra maybe for 2 or 3 days at a time, and then you often perhaps don't see them for another 12 months or so. So it's perhaps harder to build up individual relationships with players and with sections of players and know how they work. And perhaps then by the time you come back the next time, some of the personnel has changed. So perhaps it is difficult. I like to learn people's names. I think it's quite rude to go clarinet. I think it's always nice if you can address people by name, either by memorising the list of names the day before or whatever, or maybe cheating and having a little crib sheet. Again, it's just down to that personnel thing that I think is really, really important.
Yeah. Are there particular orchestras, obviously aside from the Manchester Camerata, which comes right at the top of the list, that you really, really like going back to?
Oh gosh. Most of my work tends to be UK-based. I very rarely go abroad. I have a young family. And that suits me absolutely fine to be kind of home most of the time. I invariably get back to my own bed at night, which is always nice. I do have a particular relationship with the Halle, which begins later this year, in that they very kindly have appointed me associate conductor from the beginning of next season in September. So there is a connection, if you like, with the Northwest. And I'm a local boy anyway, because I was born in Bury, so it's actually quite nice to sort of come back to the Northwest of England and have a sort of semi-permanent base there, really.
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned that. I was going to ask you about your new role with the Pops series with the Halle. Can you tell us a little bit more? Well, firstly, congratulations
Thank you
on
very
your
much.
new role.
Great.
Thank you.
Yep.
And can you tell us a little bit more about what this actually means as being?
The Halle has, for those of you who've visited, are they the oldest or the second oldest? I think this is a great debate, isn't it?
This has been, well, it had been laid to rest at the Halle and the Liverpool Phil,
Liverpool Phil. There's a little bit of rivalry between the two orchestras.
of which is the eldest orchestra in the UK.
But I think both of which have been around for 150 something years, 157 years, is it, or something? Anyway, whatever it is. The relationship I have with them basically is in the sort of role of overseeing, if you like, the pop series. They have a huge kind of breadth of repertoire that they do. Any symphony orchestra has a big breadth of repertoire. But for the Halle particularly, and for the big projects that Sir Mark Elder wants to do while he's still music director, obviously those things cost an enormous amount of money. So the Halle do a series of about 20-odd pops concerts per year, which are, by their sheer nature, populist. They hopefully bring in some revenue by packing the hall out. And that kind of offsets some of the payments, if you like, for the big expensive Wagner projects or whatever it happens to be that Sir Mark does. So it's actually really important, not only from the point of view of a sort of business sense, in that it needs to bring in some much needed revenue, but the reason I think why perhaps they've decided to create this new post, there's never been anybody in charge of the pop series before. And I think that's perhaps to kind of maybe freshen things up a bit. Maybe they got to the point where they were sort of bobbing along, oh, well, we're selling tickets anyway, let's not bother about it. And I think for the audiences and indeed for the orchestra, it's important to kind of keep it fresh and throw some new ideas in. So we will be bringing some new guest conductors in and varying the programme slightly. And it's just interesting for me, I love that whole kind of creative process when Manus, who's the artistic manager of the Manchester Camerata, and I sit down and talk about these projects, for example. One of the most exciting parts for me really is starting with the blank sheet of paper and saying, okay, what are we going to do? Let's do this. And how about if we did that? And is there an anniversary we could incorporate and we'll do this, and then fit in the guest singer, what they want to do. And that kind of whole starting off with a blank sheet of A4 and ending up with what we hope you will really enjoy as a nice varied programme this afternoon, that's the kind of part of the job that really excites me and really interests me. But to then do that on a bigger scale now, that I've got the 2014-15 diary to look at and say, well, we'll do this in this concert slot, we'll do this here, and then for the Christmas programmes we'll do this and whatever. So it's kind of that creative process, but on a bigger scale, and that's what really excites me.
That's great, fun.
Your proms debut was in 2008 with the Doctor Who concert.
I was snuck up on by a Dalek.
That's exciting. What place do you think film and television music have in the concert hall?
I think film and television music had a great place in the concert hall, more so film perhaps than, I know the Doctor Who thing was a TV series, and a lot of the music was written specifically for the series. He's absolutely brilliant. Mary Gold's music is fantastic. And it still makes you hide behind the sofa, even if you don't watch the TV. The fact that they, the one complements the other. And I think in that lies the crux, because often film music, if you listen to it without seeing the visuals, it sometimes doesn't work, and I think it's a real skill of arrangers as much as anything else to be able to make the film music work in a concert hall situation without those visuals. For those of you who've never been involved in a recording of a film score, which I suspect is most of you, it's the very last part of the jigsaw, if you like. When a director has done the final cut of the film, the music, they're almost hoovering the red carpet when the music is being recorded, because then once the music is on the film, you can't cut the film anymore. So it has to be just about the last part of the process. So a film music composer's life is very difficult, with huge sort of deadlines to meet, in that the music has to be produced very quickly, it has to be produced to absolutely fit what you see on the screen, and it's done at the very, very 11th hour. And I think because of that kind of close proximity to when the film is kind of ready to send off to the cinema, perhaps that's one of the reasons why film music sometimes doesn't work without the sort of visual, because they're so interlinked, they're so kind of, intrinsic, they're done to time codes to within a 20th of a second or whatever a frame of film is these days. So sometimes it doesn't work. Other times it does. There is some fantastic music, and I'm not just talking about sort of recently, going back to composers who perhaps left Eastern Europe for political reasons and made their fortunes in America. People like Eric Korngold, for example, fantastic composer, a child prodigy with a brilliant classical kind of career in front of him, who decided to turn his back on all of that because of what was happening in Europe at the time, and decided to flee to Hollywood. And he made an absolute fortune. He was a very wealthy man, and his music that accompanies the films that he worked on is absolutely world class. And he kind of set the benchmark, if you like, for composers that followed right up to the sort of John Williams, the sort of present day composers who write so brilliantly for film, and it's so imaginative, and as you can tell, I'm a big fan of film music. Television perhaps less so. A lot of the things that are written for the smaller screen perhaps don't always translate quite so well, but I know why you asked the question with the film and TV, because of the Doctor Who connection. On that particular occasion, we played some classical music that had a sort of planetary connection, if you like, a sort of sci-fi slant to them. So the whole programme wasn't necessarily just the music that was written for the television. We incorporated, because it was obviously aimed at a sort of younger audience, we incorporated some pieces that perhaps we thought a child-friendly audience, if you like, they would enjoy hearing live, played by a symphony orchestra, surrounded by darlings. It was a very bizarre day, I have to say, but great fun.
Yeah. You've also done a number of concerts for children, so what do you think the importance of these are?
I think the important thing with concerts for children is that you educate, of course you do, because that's part of the remit, that's part of what you do, but it's really, really important, I think, whenever you do anything for young people. I work alongside a percussionist called Alistair Malloy. Has Alistair been to Camerata? Manus, does Alistair work with you? And he's devised the whole sort of series of themed concerts. Alistair and I work together quite a lot, and I think the really important thing that he does is not talk down to the children. They're not daft, they're not stupid, they're just children, and therefore it's the life experiences that they don't have. So to kind of guide them, take them by the hand and guide them through the world of orchestra music is fantastic and enlightening, and if you can make it fun, they'll remember it. If you sit them down and go, now then, you must sit quietly and you must listen to this and listen out for this, they'll kind of switch off. And I think there's a great skill there to kind of lead them into what is a fantastic world. I mean, when we do film music programmes with younger audiences, you sit them down in front of a symphony orchestra, they don't know what to expect, and suddenly they hear these 50 or 60 people, and the beginning of Harry Potter emerges from the orchestra. And the look on their faces is incredible, because of course they know this music, they've heard it however many times, the DVD's nearly worn out at home, because they've heard it so many times. But to actually see a live orchestra perform music like that, and then they realise that that is actually what creates the sound, and how it comes out of their TVs, is actually quite a revelation. So I think it's a life experience thing, and it's guiding them through it, and hopefully opening their ears to the experiences of hearing music live, because we all enjoy it, and it's just a case of encouraging future audiences to do the same.
So is this something you're trying to include in your Halle Pop series as well?
There will be an element of that. There is a whole series also, in addition to the Pops series, there is a whole series of kind of children's concerts and education events, which the assistant conductor, a young guy called the name of Jamie Phillips, who's just taken over that role, and Jamie will do those concerts with the Halle. But yes, they do on the large scale in the Bridgewater Hall a series of those, but on a smaller scale too, going out into venues, going out into schools and working in smaller groups one-to-one in much the same way that the Camerata does the same. A huge amount of educational outreach work like that, where you kind of pare it down and send a musician out to inspire on a smaller scale of one-to-one is really, really important.
This might be a question for the audience really, but why do you think the New Year Strauss concerts are so popular?
Oh gosh, why are they popular? Well, they've been going for a long time, haven't they? Did any of you see the New Year's Day concert this year? We were in the Bridgewater Hall, so I didn't get a chance to see. Franz Welser-Most was at the helm this year in the Music Variety. What a wonderful, opulent, magnificent kind of building that is, as well as superb concert hall and brilliant orchestra too. And they have that music in their veins. I mean, they just kind of ooze that great tradition. I think the main reason why it's remained so popular is down to melody. I think that's the key to all of this. The vast majority of the waltzes, which is the sort of big production numbers, if you like, for a show like that, they are the most substantial pieces. They are the biggest pieces on the programme. And although the waltzes themselves were designed to be played at balls and to be danced to, so therefore they're not musically that exciting. That's a terrible thing to say. But they are functional in that the actual waltzes themselves serve a purpose. They were to dance to. But the melodies that we all know and love kind of linger in the memory, and I think that's the key. I'll talk about this a little bit in the concert. Sometimes the musically interesting part of the waltz isn't the waltz at all, it's the introduction or the little bit at the coda before you get a reprise of the tunes just to remind you what you've heard. That's where the composers generally used to kind of try to add a little bit of something slightly different and slightly more interesting, if you like, musically. But I think the real key to it is, for the waltzes, the melodies. We can all hum and whistle the Blue Danube or the Emperor Waltz. Those tunes kind of stick in the mind, and I promise you, you will be whistling them on the way home. And the other thing is the kind of entertainment factor, because this was the X factor of its day in a way. So if there was a particular event, or if there was a particular anniversary or something to pin a novelty piece on, and some of those wonderful little novelty pieces have got the most extraordinary kind of special effects. If you consider they were written in the middle of the 19th century, there's an explosions polka,
Yeah.
there's one that we do today, the hunting polka, which has got gunshot and all sorts of things in it, which actually is quite forward-looking in its day. But it's done purely as entertainment, and I think the fact they don't shock, they don't test your brain too much. You can quite happily sit there and let this beautiful music wash over you. And it's sometimes like going to the cinema. You don't always want to be intellectually challenged when you go to the cinema. You sometimes just want to be entertained. And I think it's the same with this kind of music, that it is well crafted, it's brilliantly well written. When it's witty, it's really witty, and the tunes just stay with you. And I think that's why it's remained popular for as long as it has.
Wonderful, thank you. Now it's your chance, the audience, to ask Stephen any questions. But perhaps first we could ask you once why you think these Strauss New Year concerts are so popular. Any ideas? Or do you just completely agree with Stephen? Of course. Yes, you do.
Phew, that's a relief,
Okay.
thank you.
Well, let's turn the table back round. So any questions you might have for Stephen?
You're very interested in film and TV music, and sometimes I'm watching TV series or a show or documentary, all sorts of different things, or even a film. I can't think of an example, but I watch when the credits come and it says music composed by or
Yeah.
arranged by, and then I go on the internet and try to find music by that person, or even a generalised group of scores of several musicians.
Yeah.
And I'm always very disappointed that you can't find
You
them.
can't find it. I wish you had an example for me. Let me try and think of what you might be thinking of. One of the highlights of my career over the last 10 years or so was being involved in the Blue Planet and Planet Earth and Frozen Planet soundtracks, George Fenton's music, which complements absolutely brilliantly, is what we talked about earlier, about the two things being so interlinked. I mean, these things, when you record them in a studio, you have the big screen in the studio, and the composer can see and can, working to sort of clicks, if you like, so that the millisecond absolutely has to match up with what happens on the screen. And George's music is absolutely wonderful at that sort of thing. Not necessarily terribly clever, doesn't intrude, doesn't get in the way of Mr. Attenborough's wonderful narrative, but complements what is going on the screen. Now, often when something like that is written specifically for a television series, perhaps if you were to hear it without seeing it on the television, you'd go, well, that's just musical wallpaper. It doesn't actually do anything, doesn't say anything.
I was thinking, again, the reason why I haven't got examples is often it's drama, and you've watched the drama,
Yeah.
and it isn't till you get to the end you think, gosh,
That music was wonderful. Who was it by? Yeah.
They must write more, those people. They don't just come from nowhere. So
No, I agree with you.
I would really like to be able to access people's music, basically.
Yeah, well, that should be easy, shouldn't it, with the internet? There are also things called library sessions, and I wonder whether this is perhaps where the ones that you've looked up perhaps has come from, in that, perhaps not so much now, because we're kind of all watching the pennies, but in the past, a session orchestra would be asked to turn up to a studio and record basically generic jingles, music, whatever it happens to be, and then a film director could go to a library and say, oh, I quite like the sound of that one, I'll use that for my piece, rather than book an orchestra or a group of musicians specifically to record music for that series. So maybe that's one or two of the instances that perhaps you've tried to look up. And maybe some of the sort of bigger name composers, film composers, then don't have the time or the capacity to do the smaller scale dramas for television. But there are a number of great composers who work. I mean, Carl Davis, for example, was another kind of household name. Did he do the music for Pride and Prejudice? Thank you. Yes, indeed. And something more recent as well, the name of which temporarily escapes me. So there are kind of composers of that ilk who will write for television, but often perhaps it's less experienced composers that haven't yet written anything for the concert hall or haven't progressed to that. So it'd be interesting to find out who you were looking at.
Wonderful, thank you very much. Oh yes, another one on the front.
What's the technically most difficult part about the Strauss waltzes? When you listen to them, you sometimes get the impression that so many changes of speed, so much rubato,
Yes.
it must be quite difficult to keep the whole orchestra together. I mean,
Yes.
presumably they've got some of that change of rubato in their head already from rehearsals.
Yep. One would hope that's what rehearsals are for. Yes.
Is that what if that isn't the technically most difficult bit about playing? What is?
I think it probably is one of the most, because this is the job of a conductor really in a potted kind of history in 10 seconds, however quickly you can do it. My job really is just to point a reference. So, of course, all the individual musicians have all the music that they need on their individual parts. Of course, the part that I'm looking at, I read vertically. I'm like a bar scanner that scans vertically across the page because I have the full picture, if you like. And so, yes, it is my job to make sure that what should be together stays together. So therefore, any rubato, any changes of tempo, any kind of changes of direction within a selection of waltzes is my... I'm digging a big hole for myself here, because if any of this falls apart this afternoon, all you people in this room will know why. But it is the case that, yes, stylistically, it's got to flow, it's got to feel right. There is a school of thought that says the authenticity of performance of some of these, perhaps you shouldn't have too much rubato, because originally they were written to be danced to. And so if you decided you were going to change speed too many times, you'd have a lot of people falling over on the dance floor. I guess some of it is down to performance practice as well, because we've all either performed or heard these pieces many times, and you kind of know where those corners are, and you sort of expect them. So it's partly correct that, yes, it is, I guess, some of the most difficult. And accompanying the voice too, because if a singer decides to do the similar sort of thing with the operetta extracts, to play with this, to play around with the speeds a little bit, you've kind of got to be there with the safety net to catch them. Good question.
Do we have one more question perhaps somewhere? No. Oh, in that case, I have a quick question for you, since you've mentioned essentially being a bar scanner. Well, how did you get into conducting? Because quite often pianists will move into conducting quite easily, because if you're playing chamber music or anything, they've got all the parts on their score. So.
Natural progression, yeah, I see. Yeah.
But for a horn player, perhaps used to only seeing one part.
Do you know, I think I conducted my first concert not quite before I was a horn player, but pretty close. I took the horn quite late. I was 14, which, when you consider you're sort of doing your auditions for music college, about sort of 17 or whatever, I suppose I was relatively late starting, and I played piano before that. But I seem to have been interested in it forever. I remember turning the radio on and listening to Norrie Paramore and the Northern Radio Orchestra and thinking, my goodness, how do they do that? And being really fascinated by, the whole kind of orchestral textures and colours and how they put all this stuff together. So I kind of feel like I've been interested in it for a very, very long time. And when I went to music college, I was very fortunate to study under the great Norman Delmar, who was not only a great character, but an ex-horn player himself. And I think perhaps he took a bit of a shine, as it were, and took me under his wing a little bit. And we spent many, many Sunday mornings pawing over scores and telling old stories and things. And that kind of kindled my interest. And then, as you said at the beginning of your interview, I took up the job as a horn player for the BBC, and it kind of took a bit of a back seat. And then for the last 15 years, I've been very lucky to have the opportunity to work with many great orchestras up and down the country. And I really, really enjoy my job. And I suppose I'm very lucky in that every day is different, and you get to do something that not only challenges but stimulates and interests and hopefully entertains too.
So finally then, we usually like to ask our guests what advice then they have for a young musician. But perhaps we could be more specific. This time round, what advice would you have for a young musician who wants to move into conducting?
Oh gosh. I don't think I've ever been asked that before. What advice would I give to an aspiring young conductor? I think to research. I think the key always to doing the kind of work that I do is preparation. If you go to an orchestra well prepared and you know your repertoire before you get there, I think it's absolutely vital. I think to try and blag it, for want of a better phrase, it's almost impossible. So my advice to a young aspiring conductor would be to research, to find out as much about all the repertoire that they may be asked to conduct as possible. To research it now is so much easier to do online with archive video and recordings and things. To get involved in all kinds of music, making chamber music, orchestra music, whatever it happens to be, and kind of learn from the inside, which is, I think, the way I came at it. And I think the sort of working knowledge of an orchestra, if you've sat in one for almost 30 years, is pretty invaluable, really. That makes me sound like an old fuddy-duddy, doesn't it? But it is. It's all down to the kind of research and sort of doing your homework and being prepared, really, I think, is the key to it.
Well, thank you very much. Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being a wonderful audience. And I really hope you've brought your dancing shoes with you for these waltzes. Yes, indeed. So please join me in thanking our wonderful guests.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Watch out for more events and updates available on our website www.venuecymru.co.uk.